nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic: how should the U.S. meet its military manpower needs?
Citing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and other world trouble spots, President Carter has asked Congress to permit the registration of men and women for possible future military call-up. Is such a step militarily necessary now? Will it lead inevitably, as its critics claim, to a draft and to a war? Why can't such a registration wait until a military emergency has been declared? And why should women be included in the registration, inasmuch as they are still not permitted to fight in combat? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today's roundtable discussion topic is: how should the United States meet its military manpower needs? Appearing on our panel today are Samuel Stratton, a Democratic representative from New York. Congressman Stratton is the third-ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee and chairman of its Investigations Subcommittee. Mr. Stratton is a retired Navy captain, recipient of 2 Bronze Star medals in World War II. He also served in the Korean conflict. Paul McCloskey, Jr. is a Republican representative from California. Congressman McCloskey, who has served in the House of Representatives since 1967, is also a decorated former military man. Mr. McCloskey, who retired from the Marine Corps Reserve as a colonel, saw action in Korea. He holds the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart. Patricia Schroeder is a Democratic congresswoman from Colorado. She is a member of the House Armed Services Committee, serving on its special NATO subcommittee and on its Research and Development Subcommittee. Mrs. Schroeder is an attorney who was first elected to Congress in 1972. Melvin Laird was Secretary of Defense from 1969 to 1973. Prior to that, Mr. Laird was a Republican congressman from Wisconsin who served as ranking minority member of the House Subcommittee on Defense Appropriations. Mr. Laird is Senior Counselor for National and International Affairs at the Reader's Digest Association. John Charles Daly will moderate the discussion. Mr. Daly has been a news correspondent and analyst for CBS News. He has also served as Vice President for News and Public Affairs for ABC. For 2 years, Mr. Daly was Director of the Voice of America. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with a problem which has plagued the nation since its birth. Our subject: how should the United States meet its military manpower needs? George Washington in 1783 declared, "It may be laid down as a primary position and the basis of our system that every citizen who enjoys the protection of a free government owes not only a proportion of his property, but even his personal services to the defense of it." Still fresh in Washington's mind were the war years, during which his forces often melted away at the end of short-term enlistments, or when planting or harvest time called the farmers home. Lincoln, suffering the same problems in the Civil War, instituted the draft and was forced to divert troops to New York and elsewhere to contain riot and rebellion. In modern times, the Selective Service Act of 1940, drafting men for 1 year's service, became law less than 15 months before we entered World War II. And a little more than 3 months before Pearl Harbor, a bill to extend that service of draftees by 18 months passed the Congress by 1 vote. The 1940 Act basically governed until the President's Commission on All Volunteer Armed Forces, created in 1970, and its report persuaded the administration and the Congress to accept that all-volunteer concept. In January of 1973, then Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, a member of our panel, ordered an end to draft calls. The 1970 Commission, headed by former Secretary of Defense Thomas S. Gates, had also recommended, and Congress mandated, that the Selective Service System shall be maintained as an active standby organization with a complete registration and classification system. But by 1976, the registration of 18-year-old males fell between the traces in arguments over mass registration on a once-a-year basis and the old system of registration on or about the 18th birthday. In 1979, concerned with the tensions in the world and the assessments of quality and quantity in the all-volunteer force, the Senate and House Armed Services Committees called for resumption of registration. The Joint Chiefs of Staff supported the legislation, the Secretary of Defense and the President opposed it, and it lost in the House by some 100 votes. Also in 1979, Representative Paul McCloskey, another member of our panel, introduced the National Youth Service Act, which calls for compulsory service but gives the draftee the choice between military and civilian community service. In the early weeks of 1980, in the State of the Union address, the President, stressing that he was not seeking and did not want authority to resume the draft, reversed the administration's position and asked the Congress to mandate the resumption of registration of 18-year-olds, including women. Secretary Laird, as previously noted, when you were in your final hours as Secretary of Defense, you ended the draft calls and launched the all-volunteer force in 1973. How well has that concept worked?
It is not working well today, John, because the Congress, the executive branch, including the Department of Defense and the American people, have reneged on their commitment to provide an adequate standard of living for the men and women of our armed forces. All we have to do today is to look at the shortage of pilots in the Air Force, 2,500. The shortage of pilots in the Navy, 2,600. 400 getting out of the service in the last quarter. I can go through all the specialized skills of the services today, and there is a tremendous shortfall. The standard of living and the income levels of the American people have gone up 80% since 1972. But the standard of living and the pay increases of our military personnel have been less than 50%. And whether you have a national service program or whether you have the draft, this is not acceptable because we are losing the kinds of skills that we need for our military establishment today. People are truly much more important than hardware in defense planning.
Congresswoman Schroeder, you've made it clear that you are opposed to registration for the draft. Why?
Well, let's say I have made it clear that I'm opposed to registration for the draft at this time. First of all, the Selective Service Act was written before I was born. And it seems to me that any corporation that was out getting their personnel with a personnel manual written 40-some-odd years ago would be in real trouble. What we truly need in our military, and that's what we should be looking at, and not World War II movies of what we need, what we truly need are skills and people that are trained. We really don't need, well, we do need some 18-year-olds, granted, but that's not quite the massive needs that we have. I think Secretary Laird very eloquently stated that. When you read all the data, they're talking about training and retaining. Those are the two key words you hear over and over and over. And we make tremendous investments in training. So if you do a massive registration, you have a World War II solution to a 1980 problem. Now, I have to say that where I think it becomes apropos is where the Appropriations Committee said it became apropos, and where our Selective Service Director said in his draft to the President that it was apropos. And that was, if there is an emergency, a massive emergency that appears to be of the World War II type of dimensions, you have predispositioned the different forms in all the post offices, and you tell everybody to go down and fill them out. In World War I, we were able to register 10 million people a day this way. And that's where you get that 7-day difference. So to say that we haven't done anything in the House isn't quite true. Last year we did pull selective service out and began to take it out of the mothballs and began to work toward a emergency mobilization. But one of the problems that you have is 18-year-olds are the most fluid segment of our society. To make that worthwhile at all, you have to keep the addresses current and everything. So you end up creating a bureaucracy to keep all sorts of addresses current. You don't have anybody classified, and you don't have the skills training. If you did a registration by skill, that makes sense. If you do those kind of things, that makes sense. But I am saying the Selective Service Act passed before I was born, going after 18-year-olds that are untrained in great massive numbers with 32 million names on a computer printout sheet, is not what we need today. And by passing it and saying, terrific, now we can all rest, I think the only people we scare are our own 18-year-olds. I don't think we scare Russian planners with that.
All right, Congressman Stratton, you are also a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and you're chairman of its investigation subcommittee. How would you assess the state of our military forces today?
Well, Mr. Daly, I think that compared to almost every other country in the world today, we obviously have very formidable military forces. The trouble is that compared to the most likely adversary, we are not adequate. We are behind the Soviet Union in almost every item of military weaponry, and also as far as our manpower is concerned. We're behind in tanks, we're behind in submarines, we're behind in planes, we're behind in missiles, but the biggest weakness of all is a weakness in manpower. The all-volunteer force has not worked. Whether pay, as Secretary Laird indicates, is the answer, I'm not sure that that's the only reason, but it certainly is an important one. But we are weak in numbers. We don't have the numbers that we need, and we're weak in quality. And the biggest weakness, however, in terms of manpower, is the fact that we just don't have the reserve forces, as you mentioned. We have 2 million individuals under arms. But if we were to get into an emergency situation, if the Soviets were to suddenly attack in NATO, for example, if the Russians were to decide to move from Afghanistan into Iran, we don't have the individuals who can reinforce our troops on the front lines, and that is the most serious shortage we have. That's the reason, that's the primary reason for registration, to come up at least with a shopping list of the names and telephone numbers of the people who are eligible for military service. And I support the President in that request. But I think we've got to go beyond that. I think in the first place, if we're going to register them, we ought to know whether they're physically qualified, and so we ought to have examinations and classifications. We ought to know who's 1A and we ought to know who's 4F. And beyond that, I don't think it makes any sense at all to have people registered for the draft and subject to call unless they are also trained to take care of themselves. And we can't wait, as Mrs. Schroeder suggests, until another Pearl Harbor hits us. We've got to have that training in advance, and I support a limited draft for the purpose of developing the individual ready reserve.
All right, Representative McCloskey, do you think that our young people are willing to accept compulsory service if given the choice of military or civilian service as you propose in the National Youth Service Act?
I think so. If they are convinced that the leadership of this country is not going to take them into a war like Vietnam, if it's accepted by the young people that the purpose of a prepared military force is so that we don't have to fight rather than that we will be drawn into adventurous conflict, I think they'll accept it. Interestingly enough, we have polled the high schools in my district, 24 of them, and we recently polled the Washington Workshop young people, 17 and 18-year-olds here in Washington, and we said, should we go back to the draft? And they said no. But what about a national youth service in which you had the option of military or civilian service? And we posed the 4 questions in that bill. There's 4 options for an 18-year-old. You can enlist for 2 years in the military service at subsistence wages, but with 4 years college benefits. You could enlist for 6 months in the reserve and 5.5 months to remain combat ready in the reserve. You can enlist for 1 year of civilian service voluntarily to serve either in your community, one-on-one with a retarded child, firefighting, community work, or you can choose none of the above, in which case you would go into a pool and you would be subject to being drafted if there were not sufficient volunteers in either of the two first categories. What's happened is that over half of the young people, the 18-year-olds, have said in that eventuality they would choose the 2 years military service. Note that that means that no draft would be necessary, because you would then have, out of 2 million young men, you'd have 1 million young men volunteering for the 2-year service. Under no stretch of the imagination do we need more than 400 or 500,000 a year. And under those circumstances, about a third would volunteer for the civilian service. There's no lack of idealism in our young people today, but a draft would have to be fair. And the problem with Representative Stratton's proposal, if you go to a limited draft today with 2 million young men becoming 18, but you only take 200,000 or even 400,000, it's going to be hard to maintain good morale in the military when 1 out of 4 is chosen and 3 of his friends are out drinking beer with their girls on Saturday night. And that's the problem with the draft today. It isn't that we want a bigger army. It's just that we have no way to make a fair draft today without taking a small fraction of those that are eligible.
All right, let's come to grips with the major nuts and bolts areas in this subject. Mr. Laird, former Secretary of HEW Joseph Califano has written that to revive the military draft system is the first realistic step since 1973 to replace the weakest weapon system in our military arsenal, the volunteer, all-volunteer force. How say you?
Well, I don't believe that you're going to save money as far as manpower is concerned by using the draft. This idea that you can use conscript labor to fulfill the lower brackets in the enlisted ranks of the Army, Air Force, Navy, or the Marine Corps just isn't acceptable in the free society in which we operate here in the United States. And somehow or other, these people that look at the draft as a way of getting cheap labor and do not fail to face up to the problems of retention in the second, third, and fourth termers are really missing the point and don't understand what modern weaponry is all about as far as the four services are concerned. So I think that former Secretary Califano's criticism of paying these young men and women on a fair basis in our society with other young men and women that choose other professions just has no place in this free society of ours. It may be all right in the Soviet Union, but it isn't all right in the United States of America.
Congresswoman Schroeder, at what point in a national emergency or international crisis should we consider registration or an actual draft? What are the trigger points?
Well, I think clearly when we start to see some hostility somewhere where we're threatened. You know, Washington's kind of a scenario factory. People sit around and throw around scenarios and you never know quite what's real. The surprise is usually that nothing that you ever thought about ever happens. It's something else. But I think that whenever you begin to see that we have some real problems, then you look at it. But we've got a lot of things out here on the table, and it's almost difficult to talk about all of them simultaneously. Now, it seems to me that the problem with the Selective Service Act is, again, it was targeting our needs to 1939, 1940, and not 1980. I think we have heard training and retaining and training and retaining among all of us up here because those skills are so important. So if you had a draft, say for skills, that would make a lot of sense. Say you registered all the pilots in America. Clearly, if we got into any kind of a war where you needed pilots and we're short of pilots, that starts to make a lot of sense. But you can't take an 18-year-old and make him a pilot overnight. If you registered people who had computer skills, that makes sense. But I'm saying we should look at what our needs are, and our needs are very much directed to taking care of this high technology equipment that we've got.
Pat, you're going to be out in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean very soon with the House Armed Forces Committee. And I hope you'll have some interviews with some of the Boilermakers on one of the carriers out there, or some of the young pilots, or some of those people that are handling planes. They've been out there at sea for 165 days. Some of them haven't been home for 6 months. They're being paid, that plane handler on the deck of that carrier is being paid $8,500 a year. He is working 100 hours a week. He isn't making as much as the checkout girl in the McDonald's hamburger stand here in Washington.
You're right.
And they're only working 40 hours. So I think you can talk all you want
You're
about
right.
registration, national service, and everything else. But let's get some money into personnel costs.
And I guess that's where I agree with you, because I'm saying we've had pay caps on since '73. We've done all sorts of artificial things, and we sit around and whine about why don't we have anybody.
Let's not talk about the draft and national service. Let's take the problem that we have right now and solve it, because it is solvable.
Mel, can I just say, I totally agree. I'm delighted to hear you say that. I think that is the real world, and that's what I'm saying. Let's look at the real world. Let's look at the problem, and that is the problem, and it's very severe.
Mr. McCloskey.
Yeah, but that's just one of the problems. And Mel, I agree with you, and I think the key to the strength of the armed services are the staff NCOs, the petty officers, and the junior officers. Those are the guts of the people that maintain these systems, weapons and communications. And I hope we'll vote the $4.5 billion in increased pay for those people. That doesn't solve the problem of your combat infantrymen, the people that if we send 4 divisions into the Persian Gulf to back up the president's statement, as Sam says, we haven't got a reserve after M+30 or M+60. The individual ready reserves aren't there. The selected reserve units are at about half strength, and most of them are aging officers or NCOs who are obtaining retirement credits. You can't find a reasonable young 18-year-old today to volunteer to be a combat infantryman if you honestly tell him that in the summer he's training in the jungle or the desert, in the winter in the Arctic. And we ran that same poll in my high schools, and we said, how many of you 18-year-olds will enlist if I tell you what you're honestly going to do as a prepared combat infantryman and have a chance to survive in combat? If we double the pay from $418 a month to $836 a month, I have yet to get a hand raised. It isn't the money that's going to attract the 18-year-old. It's the lifestyle is impossible when you compare with how the ordinary 18-year-old lives. And I think we're going to have to go back to some form of compulsion. I commanded a reserve rifle company between 1952 and 1960. We wouldn't have had one 18-year-old in that unit if it hadn't been for the draft sitting in the background where they chose to be a young Marine reservist rather than get drafted for 2 years. And I think that's the reality you have to feed in with.
I wish well on that, because when I was in the Congress back in '66, we tried to go for a national service plan. And we couldn't even get 1/4 of the House of Representatives to go along with a plan like that. They were unwilling to create the 1,500,000 jobs that you need on the outside, in hospitals, in educational units, in Peace Corps work, in all of the other ramifications, all the other jobs that you need. You have to have at least 1,500,000 new jobs created by the federal government. Sure, it's good for the military, because you get cheap labor in those early years of enlistment.
Well, the Congress is different. A lot of those guys have died, and the rest have been indicted. There's a new Congress.
Well, how many? You don't have a majority now for national service.
We're getting it. We're Pat's a co-sponsor, Millicent Fenwick. We've got a lot of co-sponsors.
We're not even sure we've got a majority for registration. That's one of our problems. And
Sam, that was one of the great mistakes of the Ford administration. You know, with the volunteer service, it was never anticipated with the Gates Commission or anyone else that we'd do away with the registration. There was no great pressure to do away with the registration, but Jerry Ford thought that it was a way to make a little budget reduction. And so he sent to the Congress a budget that had $20 million out of it that was needed and necessary in order to maintain the registration and keep it in being. And so it was stopped there, a very foolish saving at a time when there was no public uproar about registration.
Let's come back to the volunteer concept and go at one step beyond the standing peacetime regular army. Congressman Stratton, what impact has the all-volunteer concept had upon armed forces reserves? We've heard a bit of the shortage of pilots, but can we expand rapidly now to meet crisis or war itself?
No, we have, as Mr. McCloskey has already said, we have virtually no reserve whatsoever. The National Guard divisions are not at their full strength. They have been stripped of a lot of their weapons. The reserve units themselves are, as Pete has said, perhaps not quite as bad, but mostly the officer personnel, the enlisted personnel, are very limited. And the last time we called them up in the Vietnam War, some of them went to the Supreme Court to try to prevent it. What has happened as a result of the volunteer army is that we have lost numbers, and what is even worse, we have lost quality. In order to meet the numbers, the pressures on the recruiters are tremendous. We have had to reduce our physical qualifications. We have reduced the mental classification, and you've got people in there who have to be given remedial reading before they can even handle a weapon. You can't present a credible deterrent to the Soviet Union if you know that only the people who can't get a job anywhere else are the ones that are going into the service. And my proposal is that we ought not only to do the registration, but we ought to do the classification, because as we found out in Vietnam, and I think it applied in other situations as well, in World War II, the fellow who is classified 1A knows that he's going to be called when the first emergency comes. And so he would likely volunteer to go into the National Guard or into the Navy. Why should he go into the Army when he can sleep between clean sheets every night and eat steak 3 times a day? He'll go into the Navy. In fact, the commander of the New York State National Guard has said that if we classify the individuals who are registered in New York State, and that would be about 212,000 every year, he estimates that 4,000 of those kids would volunteer for the State Guard, and that would fill all of their vacancy.
We've been talking about manpower, and I think it's time to start talking about military personnel. Now, that may be offensive to people, but I think we're in a new day where we have had young women move into the military and do a good job, and I think just talking about manpower kind of shuts them out. Maybe personnel's a little more. Person power, I like that.
I've never used that term, manpower.
I did.
think that our moderator may have used the term.
Several times.
And then I want to take the liberty to ask the past Secretary of Defense a question that has always
I
troubled
hope
me.
you ask me a question about women, because I'm so very happy
Aren't they
to have been
marvelous?
there when we made our first generals in the Air Force,
Women.
in the Army, Navy, first admiral. I remember Bud Zumwalt's down talking about how wonderful it is to draft women. And I had to send the admiral list back to him 2 separate occasions because he refused to put a woman on it. Then he wanted to send it up with a nomination for and call a woman a commodore. I said, we're not going to have separate classifications for these women. Finally, I got a rear admiral from it.
Well, as you know, Pat, I was the guy that came up with the legislation to put the women in our service academies,
That's
and
right.
I think they're still hanging me an effigy at West Point.
Well, I was going to bring you both halos, but let me ask you a question, if I might, about the reserves. I think all of us are in agreement, probably at this table, that the status of the reserves is very concerning. And it's always seemed to me that even if you have people in there, at least the people I talk to in my district in the reserves get very depressed about the kind of equipment they often get. They feel it's cast off, so they always feel like they're really second class. And as Secretary of Defense, have you got any help for us on what we could do to make the reserves more viable, to make them more real, to make them a real fighting force? I think a lot of people tend to look upon them as a lobbying force and not a fighting force, or paper tigers or something, and the Congress has hesitated to call them up a lot of times. How do we make it real? Because I think that's a real concern.
The problem that you have here is when you get into the reserve, whether you get into the National Guard or into the reserve components, you get back to the same question of incentives. And there are no incentives as far as program is concerned in the reserves right now. There are no incentives as far as pay is concerned in the reserves right now. And we are losing. In many states, we're less than 50% as far as personnel is concerned in the National Guard and some of the reserve units.
I think we have to come back to what Pete McCloskey said, though, is that I don't think you're going to get people unless there is some compulsion. What we need are combat individuals. And nobody, as Pete says, is going to volunteer to be a rifleman, an infantryman, or in the armor, or in the artillery. And therefore, we might differ as to whether the idea of giving you a kind of open-ended conscientious objector classification by going into some civilian service will attract enough people to go into the military. But I think in some way there's got to be a compulsion, but it doesn't have to be anything that sounds like the Soviet Union, as you suggest, Mel. There used to be a thing regarded as obligation, that everybody had an obligation to spend some time serving his country. And the Swiss call up their young men at 20 and give them 6 months of training and send them home with a rifle, and they put it behind the door, and they have to report for summer training every year for 13 years. I don't think that that's asking too much of the American.
I say that we've got to move now. There are things we can do to solve the personnel problem. We've got to stop letting these pilots get out. It costs us $700,000 to train a fighter pilot today. And when you look at the last quarter and see 400 of them leaving, when you look at the last year and you see you have 2,600 short in the Navy, 2,500 short in the Air Force, and you go out and interview those people, as the RAND Corporation and other surveys that have been made by independent groups, and the #1 problem is pay. We are refusing to pay these people a decent standard of living for their families. We don't even give their families the same Blue Cross, Blue Shield protection that a civil service worker gets here in Washington. We pay them 10 cents a mile when they change duty stations, and the cost is at least 21 cents a mile. I can go through item by item and show how we're discriminating against our military people in the United States today, and it's up to the Congress and it's up to the administration to fulfill its commitment to these men and women.
I don't think you could double the pay for the 18-year-olds and attract them. I can't find young 18-year-olds today who, for a raise in pay, will volunteer. And I think we've got to go back to what Sam says. I think there's got to be the acceptance of a concept in this country that there is a duty to serve, to give a year or two in your youth. Once you reach that concept, I don't think we'll have any problem doing it, but I don't think you can buy mercenaries at age 18 today.
No. And I think you can do it if you get the other jobs in our society, if you develop the 1,500,000 new jobs you need for these young people in schools and hospitals, your program is viable. But when you start putting those costs between the Congress, before the Congress, you always have some difficulty, because it amounts to about $10.5 billion.
I just want to add one thing. The thing that scares me, and I had this article here from last May's Stars and Stripes. They tested 450 soldiers in West Germany and found only 7 out of 450 that could read and write and compute at the 9th grade level. And this is an army that's going to have to take on these new technical systems that you speak of. You're at the Brandenburg Gate, you're guarding an embassy in Islamabad. You need people with judgment, coolness under fire, good common sense. We haven't got that in the Army today. If you saw the President jogging in the DMZ, you can't have failed to note that most of those infantrymen up there who would be killed were black or Mexican American. The majority in the combat rifle companies are minorities. So you've got a white country, predominantly white, depending on the people who will die in the event of war, predominantly minority. And that's just wrong. And if we have to go back to a draft or some kind of compulsion...
But I think that has to do with job competition. I think that you've had a higher unemployment rate among black Americans, which is unfortunate. And so that you do get an attraction in that particular area. But I say that if you compete even for the first-term enlistees on a comparable basis with other jobs in our society, or at least at least pay them the minimum wage.
But let me add one more thing. I think you're assuming, though, that under the draft we didn't have that. I mean, we had a higher percentage of minorities under the draft also, because of a lot of things we didn't. Exemption. Well, and yeah, that we didn't like in the exemption.
But we did away with that in 1970.
Yeah, but I mean that happened under the draft too. But I think as we talk about, if you talk about going back to a draft, you have to talk about several things. Number one of the things we hear over and over and over and over again from all the service chiefs is retention, 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 retention. And I question whether if you pick up people in a draft, they will be as apt to be able to retain them after you have spent the money training.
I think you could make the point you'd have less retention using the draft.
I do too, and that I think we have to lay on the table. And I think the issue about pay, I think to both draft them and then try to save money on them would be an absolute disaster, because even under the volunteer force, they're not making enough to really survive. So if we tried to go back to $50 a month or something, I think you could have real bitterness. So I think we have to look at that. There's another piece of this that worries me very much, and that is all
Pat,
the contracting out.
We are at $50 a month.
Oh, I know. I know.
If you take the $50 a month during 1940 and compare it to the pay scale today, somehow or other people don't realize that's where we are.
Well, with your experience, could you answer this question? When we turned down registration last fall, we put into the law the requirement that the administration report back on the alternative to registration and selective service, that they consider this youth service alternative. They came back and they said the youth service alternative is the best alternative, but we don't need it because the all-volunteer Army is working. And the problem with moving to an alternative is that the Defense Department will not admit that the all-volunteer Army is failing. It's as big a cover-up as I've ever seen. And I wonder, because I've spoken to the War College each of the last 5 years. They use an old anti-war congressman as sort of a teaching mechanism to teach potential chairmen of the Joint Chief how to deal with the Congress. And it's a good lesson.
They use a couple of hawks, too.
And I ask them, I ask them privately every year, how many of you think the all-volunteer Army is working? And they all say it is not working. They think they're going to have to go back to the draft to get the quality manpower that they need at that first 2-year enlisted term. But they can't say it publicly, or they go the way of that general over in Korea who disagreed with the commander-in-chief. Now, how do we get the Defense Department to concede that the all-volunteer force concept, the total force concept, pure concept of the reserve, is not working? They keep saying that it is working, even though they have to admit that about 800,000 of that 1.2 million selected in IRR reserves aren't there. They've even had the gall to come back and say that if we got into an emergency, they'd pull in Vietnam veterans. I don't think Vietnam veterans would go, first of all. But that's their reserve as they conceive it. How do we get them to admit, without destroying morale, that the all-volunteer force isn't working?
Well, I believe that first you're going to have to maintain the commitment that we made to the military. And that was that we would keep salaries competitive on the outside. I think that you first have to meet that commitment. That requires a 21% pay increase now across the board, not only as far as the regular forces, but as far as the Reserve and National Guard is concerned. And it requires the other things that you talk about, the things that the families on the submarines talk about, the fact that right now we're underfunding by $2 billion the cost of moving these families every 3 years.
You've never dodged a question before. The question was, how do we get the Army to admit that the all-volunteer force concept isn't working?
Appropriate the money and see if it doesn't work, because you haven't appropriated the money yet.
Well, we'll give them the money for
will
those
you?
middle
I
ranks.
doubt if you will. You think you will, but I doubt if you will. If you provide the additional money that's needed in the budget, then I'd say you have a chance of proving your
I think the great
program
tragedy
as a possibility.
The great tragedy.
And I don't believe you have any chance of getting that money appropriated.
Yeah, I think Pete and I are talking about something that has to go beyond what is before the Congress now. The reason that the Appropriations Committee didn't vote the money is that they weren't convinced that registration all by itself was going to resolve the matter.
Why?
And nobody from the Defense Department would say, well, yeah, sure, we're going to have to move to a draft later on. They say, oh no, we just want registration. The draft, idea of drafting, that's the last thing in our minds. Well, you can't kid the American people like that. If you're going to get a driver's license, you're going to be driving a car. If you get registration, you've certainly got some kind of draft down the line.
Mel, I hate to think that you're right, but the record of the Congress in times of peace has not been very good about funding an army prepared to fight the next war. And this particular period is the worst I've ever seen in our history, because the next war, I'm afraid, will be like Korea. It will come upon us with about 3 days' notice, and the conventional part of it will be over in 3 months or 4 months. So unless our people are ready to train in peacetime to fight that quick, hard, short, tough conventional war, it isn't an army at all. If we don't do it, if Congress isn't up to voting the money for the professionals, and I view that as a second problem, should we not move immediately to a national youth service today if that will get us the qualified 18-year-olds to fill up with these reserves that we don't now have?
I have no problem in moving in that particular direction as far as national service, and that was the program that I felt, and as a member of the Defense Appropriations Committee in 65, 66, was the direction in which we should move. But the American people, the Congress, and the executive branch would not buy that. And so the alternative was to start paying the young men and women of our military services on a competitive basis with other segments of our society. And so we chose that particular alternative as a better alternative to conscript labor in the draft.
Let me say, I think we have opened this subject very broadly, and it's only fair to our audience that we give an opportunity to them to enter into the question and answer session. So may I have the first question, please?
Millicent Fenwick, I come from New Jersey, 5th Congressional District, New Jersey. You know...
A very prominent member of Congress.
Well...
Hear, hear.
All of you are so expert, and not in an ivory, but in a blue tower. And I don't think that the Congress or the public is going to vote for registration or large salaries or anything else until we get many people who are expert in the administration talking with one clear voice. We cannot have it. Again, we don't know what direction is necessary. We don't know what the country's interests demand, because first we get one signal and then another.
Millicent, you have a wonderful way of saying things, and I think you are so right. I think the American public is so confused as to every day there's another crisis in another place that suddenly becomes our whole thing, and we're not sure where our allies are doing or anything else, and that's very serious.
Let me ask, probably this is one of the things that Mrs. Fenwick is referring to. Didn't you have to file a Freedom of Information action to get a hold of a selective service report which had been promised to you previously or something like that?
John, let me tell you, that's very frustrating. Both Congressman McCloskey and I had worked very carefully on the language we wanted in the study. And part of it was the youth service and all sorts of things.
Now, this is the selective service study of the manpower.
That's right. And on the day of the State of the Union, there were people on the radio saying the president is going to call for registration tonight. And since I had carried the amendment, I started calling the White House saying, is he? If he is, I think it would be nice if he would tell me. Everyone said, oh, no, let us read to you from this draft. So they read, you know, and we're the experts, we're DOD, we're selective service, we're the ones that know, and we have finished this thing. This is our final draft going to the president, and it says registration won't accomplish what we want, and here it all is. Well then, you know, he goes down and he says he's for registration. I get home that night and they phone and say, we're terribly sorry, Mrs. Schroeder, we didn't know he was going to do that until 6 o'clock that night, and I told him that my phone was working at 6 o'clock also. Well then I said, do you suppose I could have the draft proposal that you were quoting from? And nobody could find it. It got misfiled and all sorts of things. Finally, after 2 weeks of calling every day and getting tired of calling every day, I filed a Freedom of Information Act thing. Then I picked up the Washington Post and found out that George Wilson was able to get it. Then I found Senator Hatfield was able to get it and put it in the record. And I still haven't gotten it. It still hasn't gotten over there. So you really wonder what is going on and what is happening.
I think Millicent hasn't really had her question answered. And I assume that it was a question, namely, why hasn't the administration leveled on the whole idea of registration? And I said myself that I think it's necessary to go beyond registration. But I think you have to recognize, Millicent, that there are political problems. We're making a very substantial change. The president himself has made a 180-degree turn. And when you start talking, as we are, in terms of a real draft, this, a lot of people feel, is going to be dynamite. And so we've got to move slowly into this field on both sides of the political aisle to get the American people sold on the idea.
Sam, you know perfectly well that we cannot persuade any of the public to believe that anything is necessary unless they are clearly told. Every time you have this problem with communications, we know what happens. You just create political problems because one segment of the population will rest on one of the statements and another will take the other. We cannot expect the public and the members of Congress who are not expert like you to understand all these complications. The difference between the selective reserve and ready reserve is unknown. And nobody seems to talk clearly about what the facts are. And until I ask you, if any of you thinks that we're going to be able to have any kind of movement in this field, say nothing of the money that the Secretary feels we need, without some clear explanation as to why.
Well, I think I could make a better explanation, but I'm not running the Defense Department, unfortunately.
Yes, sir.
My name is James Hubbard. I'm with the American Legion. I would like to make an observation. First of all, I think there is general unanimity up here on the panel that the pay and benefits accrued to our armed forces today are somewhat, in fact, vastly inadequate. Given the fact that deficit spending on the part of the Congress and the federal government probably has something to do with our inflation rate today, I would like to take a short poll of the active members of Congress right now. Are the members of your district, your constituents, the people who elected you, willing to spend out of their pocketbooks in the form of taxes the money necessary, whether it's 10 or 20 or 30 or $40 billion, to bring the pay and the benefits of our active duty armed forces and reserves up to where it ought to be right now?
All right, we'll run that poll. Who would like to vote first?
I think yes. I think the people will accept the $4 to $6 billion necessary to bring up the middle-level pay to the 100% parity that Laird mentioned.
I think yes, too. I think if we go out and give them a straight story as to why it's really needed, they'll buy it. It's when we start throwing symbols at them and talking about fuzzy things such as resolve, they don't understand that. But if you say, this is what we need, my goodness, they're trying to survive an inflation also. They will certainly understand that. One of the things we have stopped doing at this federal government level that I think is so wrong is we have done away with the incentive to do the right thing. It seems like we reward the guys who blow it, whether they blow their companies or blow their cities or what have you. And so we're not rewarding the people who are in the military. If you go out and sell it to your district that way, these are the people who are doing what we've asked them to do, serve their country, and we're running out on them. I think they understand it.
Mr. Stratton.
I'm not sold on the idea that the pay is the only problem. We've been increasing it. We've increased it in the past. As I've said, we've made studies of whether pay is the real question, but I would certainly agree that there is a requirement for an increase, but I don't think it's just pay. We've got to expand our budget. I think we're thinking in terms of reordering our priorities the other way from what that slogan was in the middle of the Vietnam War, that maybe we're going to have to cut back on some of our other programs in order to provide the basic gut defense capability that we've got to have if this country is going to survive. And I would say that the American people would go for that if it's explained to them in the right way, as Mrs. Fenwick suggests.
You escaped. You're not in Congress anymore. Next question, please. On this side.
I'm
Yes, sir.
General Roberts of the Reserve Officers Association. We have a lot of interest in this subject. And Mr. Schroeder, I wondered, what is your position with regard to drafting women in the event that we do eventually return to the draft for men? And also, do you propose limitations on the various jobs women would hold in the military?
I thought no one would ever ask. Okay, let me put this out on the table, and I think we really have to say this. Doggone it, People have really misconstrued the history of American women when they say we don't want to do our part, we want a special benefit. If you look at prior wars of the West or what have you, women have always gone out and done their part. I was fascinated going out and reading about military outposts in the West. Starting in 1802, they had women there, right in the combat zone. Now, they were doing laundry and that type of thing, but by golly, they were there and subject to fire and everything else. And they put them out there and they gave them the same benefits that they gave the enlisted people. Now, women will do it again. Yes, if women are needed, women should be included. I think you know that most of the positions we draft for are non-combat. It's like a 7-to-1 ratio. There's an awful lot of things we can do. We have phenomenal manual dexterity. We can do all sorts of repair things. And I certainly think women want to do their part that way. And I really regret that a lot of women have said, no, let the country go down the chute before I'm going to lift a finger. Now, whether you're going to put them in combat, no, I don't think you put them in combat unless they really want to be there. If you've got someone that's highly motivated, highly skilled, and can do the job, such as a jet fighter pilot, and that we consider a combat slot, why deny them if they can go in and do it? But I'm not sure that I don't believe that everybody in combat should be volunteer if at all possible, because I think you want the highest possible morale. And if you have to keep a gun at the guy's back to keep him on the front line, you've blown it. So I would tend to go that way. But certainly women should help. We've gotten an awful lot out of this country, and we owe the country the same thing that men do. And I certainly would do my part, and am very disgusted when women say they won't.
Mr. Stratton?
Well, I don't think that women should be drafted, but as I've said, I have no objection to women volunteering. And I think the women, there's no reason why women shouldn't be in the combat zone. If we have come to a crisis where every individual has got to perform some kind of service, the way things were in the Battle of Britain, then perhaps we could draft them for that kind of home front duty. But I don't think we should be drafting them for combat service.
Mr. McCloskey?
I don't think we should draft them unless we pass the Equal Rights Amendment. If we pass the Equal Rights Amendment, then I think we have to draft them. I think equal rights mean equal obligations. I defer to Mel Laird on this as to how many jobs in the military today can be done as well by women as by men. I think it's substantial. It's well over half.
The Air Force, it's 76% of the jobs.
I think it's a very high percentage.
We have room for just one more question. Yes, sir.
My name is Robert Alpern of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Churches and Fellowships in North America. The question before the American people at this time and the United States Congress is not the draft, not the national service, which it is questionable whether Congress has the power to enact, as it only can enact really conscription, but draft registration. And Secretary Laird has pointed out a course that would really do something for U.S. strength, if that is what we want, which registration would not do. My question is of concern for what will happen to all the American youth who refuse to register for service on a pre-mobilization basis. It is estimated that about 30% of American youth between 18 and 26 oppose draft registration. If only 1 or 2% of the 19 and 20-year-old category, which would amount to 4 million, if only 1 or 2% of those people refuse to register, we would create a new class of felons in this country, anywhere between 40 and 80,000. What would we do with these young people, and what would that mean to the rest of the world if the opposition of American youth were as great as this?
All right. Mr. McCloskey?
Yeah, 2 Stanford law professors have suggested, and they do this in one other country in the world, not that people go to jail if they don't want to register, but if they deny the duty to serve the country, they be denied the privileges, say, of use of the national parks, use of the federal highways. I think that you might find that that might be very effective in causing young people to choose to register. And I think in my plan it isn't a forced conscription of civilian service. It means that anybody who wants to do civilian service can do that and avoid any necessity of military service. That's why I think the youth service is the answer to this question. No one need go to jail.
I'd like to respond to the gentleman by saying that I think we keep thinking of this sort of thing in the Vietnam framework. I don't think that you're going to have all of these people going to Canada if you ask them to go to Fort Dix for 4 months out of their life to find out how to become a part of the military.
I feel very strongly that whenever the government asks its citizens to do anything, it is a very important trust relationship. And whenever you ask them to do something, they are entitled to a justification as to how it will make a difference. And that's the thing that concerns me the most. I'm not sure what I can say to those young people as to how this will make a difference today with the scenario we have when we know we need all these other things that will give us more readiness right away. And I'm not sure it's worth going through that. Now, if we're really in a tight spot and there is an emergency going on and we need them and then they do it, that's different. Then we talk about something else. But we are asking them to do something, and I don't think the case has been made for the plan as it is now to ask them for that duty.
Well, John, I just hope that our viewers get the idea that we have broken a commitment to the young men and women that are in our military forces today. That commitment was to give them a competitive standard of living, and they do not have it today. Let's not get into all of these side debates. Let's solve this problem that's solvable now. It takes a little money. It takes a little sacrifice on the part of every citizen in this country, but we better start paying this bill and not continue to renege on this commitment to these men and women.
Hear,
But
hear.
that doesn't do anything for the question the gentleman asked.
I think it does. I think that answers the gentleman's question.
You think if we pay them more, they'll serve anyway, is that it?
I think that's the road we've been walking for some time. And we have run out of time. This concludes another Public Policy Forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our hearty thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Congressman Samuel S. Stratton, the Honorable and former Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird, Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder, and Congressman and Colonel United States Marine Corps retired Paul N. McCloskey. And we also want to say our thanks to our guests and our experts in the audience for their participation.
This Public Policy Forum on how to ensure that this country's military manpower is always ready has brought you the views of 4 experts in the field. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.